Welcome to this Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris, and our topic today is connected speech. I'd like to begin today by asking the fundamental question, what is connected speech? And to do so, I looked in Thornbury's New A to Z of ELT, where we had the very useful definition that connected speech refers to the way that speech sounds are produced as a part of a continuous sequence rather than in isolation. And you may think it's a strange place to start looking at this connected speech rather than, as most training courses do, looking at individual sounds. But there is a reason for this. Connected speech is what we certainly will expect our students to hear when they're listening. And also for some students, it will be important for what they produce in terms of the kind of English they want to be able to speak. So I've always felt that connected speech is actually the starting point for helping our students in their pronunciation and in their ability to decode language. Now, in today's pronunciation, we're going to look at some of the main features of connected speech, which you can see here on screen. And that is when sounds link up with other sounds, when sounds intrude, when sounds change, and when they disappear. Now, this terminology is relatively simple and is very student friendly. And it may be that you've been put off connected speech because you've heard this strange metalanguage, catenation, assimilation, and juncture, for example. So one of the points I'm going to be making today is how important it is to try to make connected speech as untechnical and as student-friendly as possible. So that brings me on to the next part of the presentation, which is just to look at what we'll be talking about and thinking about today. And I want to begin with a reflective question, and that is, which pronunciation model should you and your learners be aiming at? I then want to look at some of the features of connected speech, and in this I borrow from Richard Caldwell and his garden metaphors. We'll then move on at the end to think about which features are right for your learners. So let's begin then with that big question, that reflection question. And it may well be this is something you've not really thought about before. And certainly early on in my career, I just wasn't even aware that it was a question to think about. And the question is as follows: which pronunciation model should my learners aim for? And I think there are a number of choices facing you and the learners, and it's only right that we let them in on the choices. So the first one is that classical BBC English, not dissimilar, I guess, to the way that I speak, also known as RP, received pronunciation. Quite different from this is the Lingua Franca core. And this is the kind of English that international speakers of English automatically use with one another. So if we're using English as a contact language, so if we have, for example, a Chinese learner speaking to a German learner, or indeed in the business context, an Italian business person speaking to someone from Russia, then in this Lingua Franca core tends to emerge quite naturally. And then it may well be that you want something else, something in the middle. You may be very happy with your students having a very marked accent based on their L1. But it is, I think, crucial that you think about this, because it will affect the way that you teach pronunciation, and therefore, as a result, the way that you teach connected speech. Let me show you how and why. Well, here at the top of the tree, you can see connected speech, and beneath it, speaking and listening. You may be thinking, why is Neil even putting listening on screen here? Well, if you think about it, If students are unfamiliar with what happens with sounds and how they change when we speak rapidly, and therefore we connect sounds together in a sound stream, then it's going to affect how they perceive the language and how they are able to decode it. So thinking about the kind of English they're going to be listening to and the kind of English they're going to be speaking to is just as important, I think, as how we're going to model the language for them and how we want them to reproduce the language. So I'm going to suggest, and you can see two colors here, listening in red. So I think this is key. If you have students who are in the so-called inner circle countries, that is the countries where English is the L1 and the dominant L1, you're probably going to want to spend time with those students working on connected speech because it's what they're going to hear. Likewise, even if you're working in a country in the outer circle, or indeed the expanding circles, where English is very much not the L1, you may think that it's important for them to be able to understand the features of pronunciation that they're going to hear in their exams. And particularly if they're taking international exams, you may well feel that connected speech is really important. Likewise, as far as speaking is concerned, if you go, and traditionally this is what course books did, if you go for RP or indeed hyper RP, and let me demonstrate that to you. Good morning, it's very nice to meet you. How do you do? Then actually it has been suggested that this model of English is very difficult for students to tune into. And likewise, it's also been suggested that if you have students in the UK, at least, that if connected speech doesn't feature in how they pronounce the language and they speak like this all the time, each word is pronounced very carefully and enunciated very clearly, you're going to get students who simply sound very unnatural. So I think in making decisions about the model that we're going to use, we need to consider the students' needs in terms of listening and speaking. If Lingua Franca is your goal, then one thing I do want to make you aware of is the fact here on the left in red are the areas that are really important for intelligibility. And that's what the English Lingua Franca core aims for. It aims for students being able to understand one another. Whereas here on the right is an inventory of the pronunciation features that traditionally appear in course books. If you look in the Headway pronunciation series, for example, all of these appear, but in fact, you'll see features of connected and fast speech are not considered necessary for intelligibility. In other words, if I speak like this, it's not going to impact my intelligibility, but it may impact how natural I sound. So moving on then, I'm going to presume that for whatever reason, that connected speech is something that you do think is important for your learners, either for the purposes of being able to decode what they listen to, or indeed as features of their own speech production. So to do that, I'm going to borrow from the work of Richard Cordwell. And I think this man is a genius. He has spent a lot of time looking at how, when we teach our students how to listen, that we need to allow them into the secret of decoding and being able to decode fast and connected speech. And if you've seen any of his videos, and you can look up Richard Cordwell on YouTube, for example, you'll notice that he uses the metaphor of the garden, which explains the picture, the slide here on screen. So let's see what this all means in terms of intelligibility, connected speech, and the kind of connected speech that you want to teach in the classroom. Down here is a copy of the link to the video. It's actually now available via Facebook, and this will be available in chat when we come to the live lesson and later on. So if we look at this picture, a slightly unusual one, and it's the photograph that we want to focus on. We've got a Dalek here, dressed up in pink, and something to drink, and someone offering the Dalek a drink. So the question is, what do you think the person in green is saying to the Dalek? And if you came up with the answer, would you like a cup of tea? Well done. Absolutely. A very English thing to say, I think. But the question here is this. Would you like a cup of tea? How do you, as the teacher, say this naturally? How would you say it in the classroom? Would you say it in the same way as you would say it naturally? Or would you change it in some way based on your learners? Are they the same, therefore? Why? Why not? And some people might argue that at lower levels, you might want to slow things down. Would you like a cup of tea? So the reality is that in terms of enabling our students to listen to English and also to produce it, there are, I think, 3 levels that exist. And the first level is what Caldwell has referred to as the pant plot. And here on screen is his own explanation in the video that I mentioned of what this actually means. So he talks about how we teach words as if they were individual plant pots in the greenhouse. And you can see from the way that I'm reading this, we model for pronunciation purposes very clear pronunciation and single citation form sound shapes of words. So what he means by that is that the individual word becomes the point of focus. Of course, if we speak like this all the time, it's going to sound, for many people, very unnatural. And of course, it's not going to reflect what students hear much of the time. So quite rightly so, Caldwell moves on to his next level, which he refers to using his gardening metaphor as flower beds and the garden. And he then talks about how in the classroom, at least, we apply these rules of connected speech. So rather than saying, would you like a cup of tea, the individual words are laid out together and they flow. So much as, and this is the point of the metaphor, we've got a nice flow of color here. Likewise, in the garden, we would expect language to flow more and to give a different sound feature. So instead of, would you like a cup of tea, we get something like, would you like a cup of tea? Now, interestingly, if you go out there, and by out there, I mean those inner circle countries like the UK where I live, you may not actually hear connected speech quite that clearly. Would you like a cup of tea may well come into something that to a learner will be entirely incomprehensible. It's going to be unruly. It's going to sound very difficult to get through. And in the same way as it's difficult to walk through the jungle and to penetrate it, if you hear someone saying, we like cup of tea, will you like cup of tea? Then understandably, we may decide that this form of English, the jungle-like variation, where the rules and the recommendations of connected speech as we teach them break down, and what happens in the real world, that we're actually going to have to kind of rethink what we're doing in the classroom. Now, the crucial point here is that I'm not arguing necessarily for students saying, we like cup of tea. What I am saying is that as far as connected speech is concerned, if we take it out of its speaking area and we put it into its listening area, if you have students who are in the UK, you're a UK-based teacher, or if you have students who aspire to working in the UK in the future, and you are teaching them knowing they're going to go to the UK, perhaps we owe it to them to let them in on the secret of this jungle English in terms of decoding the language. In other words, what they're going to hear, the listening sphere of connected speech. So as Caldwell says himself, we need to train learners to be better at decoding and understanding. So just to put this into context for you, I thought a bit of a matching quiz would be nice. So 1, 2, 3 here are our 3 versions of that question. Would you like a cup of tea? Number 1. Number 2, would you like a cup of tea? Number 3, we like cup tea. And if we think about how we match them to check our understanding against the 3 pictures. So I'll just pause here for a few seconds to give you some thinking time so you can decide which picture matches with which realization of that piece of target language. So if you decided that the plant pot matches with the individual forms, would you like a cup of tea? Great, well done. Likewise, the nicely ordered flower bed in the garden is the second form. Would you like a cup of tea? And then this messy jungle, impenetrable, is that final form. Would you like a cup of tea? And we can see here that all sorts of things are disappearing and changing. We've got the d at the end of wood completely disappearing. We've got vowel length changes. U becomes y, and so on. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in the rest of this presentation. How do we get from would you like a cup of tea to would you like a cup of tea? And then the much messier, we like cup of tea. Now, in order to understand this, I think it's important to understand the distinction between different types of language. And to do that, I'd just like to really focus on this very useful activity that you can use in the classroom. And we've got 3 words, and it refers to who's next in the queue. You, me, him. Now, notice what happens if we add words to it. So if we add the word and, we get a longer stretch of language. And if we then add the word then as well, we get another longer still stretch of language. And if we have the full form, and then it's you, and then it's me, and then it's him, we get a longer bit of language still. So the question is, how do we do this in English? Let me show you. So the important distinction here, I think, is between syllable and stressed time languages. And the definition is here on screen. So as you can see and as you can read, a syllable time language is one where the syllables take approximately equal amounts of time to pronounce. So if we go back to that final sentence here, the word and the word then and the word it's and the word you all have equal weight. They take relatively similar amounts of time. So quite reasonably, a 3-word sentence here would be much quicker than the number of words it takes here, considerably longer. Stress time languages, however, there is approximately the same amount of time between stressed syllables. So whatever comes between the stressed syllable, 1 sound, 2 sounds, 3 sounds, must obviously get squeezed to fit it all in. And that's actually really what's happening in terms of fast speech and connected speech. Now, question, what kind of language is British? Well, I'm sure those of you who are familiar with teaching features of British pronunciation, even if you're unfamiliar with terminology, will have worked out that this is what English does. It squeezes. English is a stress time language. So then you might be thinking, well, okay, great, Neil, thanks very much. What languages are syllable timed? And one of the examples that is used a lot is French. Now, let's be clear here. It's not quite as simple as I'm suggesting. In other words, it's not a on-off binary opposition. As people have spent more time analyzing, and particularly with acoustic phonetics, people have begun to realize that, French, for example, is beginning to get aspects of stress time in it. So there is a kind of a blurring of the distinctions. But for the purposes of our students, I think it's very reasonable to make the point that English is a stress time language, and therefore students have to be able to cope both in their pronunciation when they're speaking, but also in their decoding when they're listening of what's happening in that squeezing, in those bits between the stressed syllables. If I go back in the presentation, if you, me, him are the content words, those are the information words that tell us who's in the queue and what order they're appearing in. Everything is here is going to get squeezed. So how actually does that work? Well, it works like this. You, me, him, then you and me and him, and it's you and it's me and it's him, and then it's you and then it's me and then it's him. They actually take the same amount of time. Now, this is really confusing for learners of languages which are primarily or entirely syllable timed. They have difficulty recognizing and then producing these features of connected speech in English. And those features, importantly, will be weak forms, the sound, schwa, but also what happens at word boundaries and how when they come together, they change, they link, they disappear, and other sounds come in, extra sounds. And that's really what I want us to be focusing on at a kind of a general level here today. So let's begin by just thinking about weak forms. And there are, in fact, more than schwa, but schwa, I think, is an important one. So let's go back to that cue. You, me, him. What you'll notice is that we don't say and you and me and him. Now, if I do this with a French accent, you'll automatically recognize I'm turning English into a syllable stress language, and you and me and him. In fact, what English does is it shortens a to e. D disappears, so the word and gets shrunk. It becomes un. Same happens with the word then. It becomes then. Same happens with its. It becomes uts. So what you get for the bits that get shrunk is and then its becomes then its. As you can see, it's much quicker. And that's what gives the rhythm of English. And that's what causes our students so much difficulty, because they'll be saying, what word is and then it's? I can't find the word and then it's in the dictionary. No, because they're unable to decode it into its constituent parts of and then it's. So let's look at these aspects of connected speech. And I've got 4 example sentences here, each of which illustrate a different form of connected speech in real time. So I'll have some of those apples, please. I'll have some of those apples, please. Some of those apples, zapples. I saw a fantastic movie last night. More quickly, I saw a. Your computer was a goodbye. Goodbye. Can you hear the d there? Shouldn't be able to. Goodbye. And then finally, an old man lives next door. Old man lives next door. What's happening here? Well, for those of you who find it difficult to tune in to English, let me just show you where these examples of connected speech features are coming in. Some of, zapples, Sora, goodbye, old man. What's happening here? Well, here in blue on the right are the 4 features that we're looking at today. Let me give you just a few seconds to read them. And the key bit is in the middle. The sound is left out. Something disappears. Something links up. Something is changed and a sound is added. And this is the kind of language I much prefer to use with students. So rather than kind of struggling with catenation, assimilation, intrusion, and so on, just talk to them about disappearing, linking, changing, and extra sounds. It's just so much easier. What we need to do now is link up these 4 features of connected speech with the examples here on the left-hand side. So just give you a few moments to have a think about how these link together. Okay, so let's have a look at the answers. So the first one, some of zapples, is an example of a consonant sound linking to a following vowel sound. M, o, mov, or indeed in more faster speech, of, mov. Apples, zapples. In number 2, what did you think? If you talked about an extra sound, well done, because saw a becomes sora, sora. So the reason that this is happening is it just makes the transition between or and a, or indeed here or and easier to make. Goodbye, a goodbye. Different, aren't they? The first one's more natural. This is where the final consonant sound here, the d, is changed by the sound that follows it. If you've got d followed by b, d, b, it's actually quite difficult to get your mouth around. So naturally, if you're making the sounds in the right place in the mouth, the sounds will modify. And then finally, in this last one, old man, old man. The d is left out. It disappears. It's actually quite difficult with the rhythm of English to be able to say an old man. It just doesn't glide very well. That's why the d disappears, to make it easier to say old man. Okay. Now, of course, if you've got learners who are very visual and they've learnt the language by reading, and of course, reading is a fantastic way to learn English, this is going to cause a problem, because when they start hearing it, they're going to be, what's going on? So I'm showing you on screen now the terms that I use for these 4 features: linking, extra, changing, disappearing. For those of you who have come through books that use more complicated meta-language, I thought it would be useful just to also show you how these are referred to in some course books and in the literature, in some of the academic studies. So the linking sound is an idea of catenation. And to help you remember this, if you think about a bicycle chain, there are lots of individual parts that are linked together. If you speak a Romance language, you may be aware that one of the common words for chain is catena, catenation. It's a chain of things linking together. Next one, the extra sound, intrusion. A sound muscles its way in, it intrudes. It's also referred to as liaison in certain circumstances. The changing sound, one gets more like the other. So the d kind of moves towards the b. So assimilation, becoming more similar. And then the final one, elision. Okay, so let's have a quick look at each of these. So also, let's think about when to teach them and how to teach them. Well, there are, I think, a number of options here. And the first one is, and this is actually very popular in language schools, is where you may have an elective course that just looks at features of pronunciation. Does it work? For students who are really focused and who get it, yes, I think this can be a very useful additional resource. But I don't think that pronunciation taught in isolation as a special area is necessarily always the best way to do it. So I would definitely suggest that if you're teaching new language, you should be teaching the features or the salient features of how the pronunciation changes. And a really nice example of this is can for ability. I can sing. K, schwa. Question, can you sing? Answer, yes, I can. No, I can't. So we've got a mixture of weak and full forms there, which I think is really important to introduce very early on in the presentation of the language, and ideally before the students see the language. I quite often see in training courses, trainee teachers will write up the language on the board and then drill it. No. As soon as someone sees the language, second language acquisition is showing us that they then use their parameters from their L1 to decide what they think it sounds like. And it's very difficult to get them back again into what it actually sounds like in English. So rather than drilling with the form on the board, contextualize the language, drill it before it's written down, and then show them the written form. And possibly at that stage, what do you notice to make them aware that although the spelling looks the same, the actual pronunciation in fast speech differs? And that's the point I'm putting in the arrow here. Sensitize the learner to the pronunciation before they see it. And then, of course, there's the opportunity to give remedial feedback. So a student's been doing a speaking task, and there was a particular area that you wanted them to be working on, or was a particular problem that they had. You bring their attention to it after the end of that speaking task in a feedback session. Okay, let's move on and have a look at some of the examples of these types of fast speech. And the first one is linking plus the rhotic r. So linking, remember, that chain, that catena, is where the last consonant, some, and the next vowel sound, of, link together, and the m moves to the some of, mov. A really nice example of this was a German student who asked me once, teacher, what is napple? I don't know. When did you hear this word? Oh, this morning my homestay asked me if I wanted to have a napple for lunch. And I didn't answer because I was embarrassed and because I don't know what napples are. Student had heard napple, which was a nice example of this catenation, this linking sound of an apple, napple. Okay. The example. So here's the example. You know, I've used from real life from my German student 10, 15 years ago here. Pick it up. Pick it up. Kit up. What's it? Or what is it? So the r sound, and those of you who are familiar with the comedy series that goes out on BBC, it's ended now, The Vicar of Dibley, nice example of this, is that we have the term for a holy man or a holy woman, a vicar, and the r is silent in most forms of British English. But when it follows a vowel sound, it becomes vicar of, vicar of Dibley. Now, this isn't the case for all aspects of English, by the way. If you're up in Scotland, the r is roticized, and you'll hear them say, oh, I haven't been to see the vicar. Okay. Moving on, the extra sounds, the intrusion. So typically the sounds that will come in and intrude are r, y, and w. So if we try and say these next pairs of words, law and order, law, run. I agree. I agree. Go away, go away. What we can clearly see happening here are examples of the intrusion of the r here, run. And then we've also got a bit of linking here potentially, and order. But the linking is taking place between the Lauren. Then we have the y, I agree, and the w, go away. Why this is happening is going to be a feature of a further gallery teacher's masterclass. So today is really just about making you aware of some of the main features. Assimilation, and if you remember the example we used here was goodbye. Now, assimilation is where the sound, a phoneme at the end of one word causes a change in a sound in a neighboring word, the word that follows it. And this just simply is about making it easier to say in fast speech. So here's some examples for you. In bath. Last year. Hyde Park. You'll notice that the final consonant here, n, t, and d, is not what we hear. In bath, last year, Hyde Park. The n becomes a m, in bath. The t becomes a ch, last year, cheer. And the here, the d, Hyde, becomes a b to make it easier to link. Hyde Park. Other examples, 10 boys, n to again, to make the transition from the n to the b, b are closer in the mouth. And therefore, in speech, we look for shortcuts to be able to get the language out to respect the rhythm of English being a stress time language. Nearly the last one, disappearing sounds. Elision, I prefer, as I know, as I've said already, to call them disappearing sounds, is that loss of a phoneme. And this typically occurs around t and d sounds. So here's some examples. Left back, stand by, look back. Now, if you're a Spanish speaker, this is heaven, because Spanish tends to drop the final t and d. You know, if you think about the capital of Spain itself, Madrid, the d has disappeared completely. Left back, stand by, look back. And all that's happening here, final example, must go, is that the phoneme of the last sound, the consonant sound of the first word, is elided with the consonant that follows it. And again, this is to do, in putting it quite simplistically, with helping the mouth to make the transition. So t b is much more difficult than f b, left back. Likewise, d b, and you know, if you look at my mouth, d b, there's a lot going on there. If I say stand by, stan, notice the shape of the mouth, stand by. It doesn't really change nearly as much as stand by. So in other words, we're going from to and we're avoiding the d in the middle. Don't forget, of course, that we also have examples of this elision happening in the middle of words as well. So sandwich, castle, police, are some common examples. I did just want to make you, because I think this is kind of fun, to make you aware of the final one, juncture. Have a look at these pictures. What are they all eating? Okay. And so you can imagine the excitement with these kids when they get their ice cream, go, I scream when I get an ice cream. Ah, ice cream, mummy, thank you. For daddy as well, of course. And so which one am I now saying? Ice cream. Ice cream. Now, native speakers get this. And the reason for that is the context helps them to be able to work out that the first ice cream is a subject pronoun with a verb, and then the final one is a noun. It's a compound noun. And what they won't be able to do is actually analyze what's happening, the difference between ice cream and ice cream. And it's to do with these three features here. Now, I would not recommend going into class and telling your students that the difference between the two is to do with the shortening of the vowel sounds or the lengthening of the vowel sounds, delaying or advanced articulation. They're just not going to understand what you're talking about. But I think it is worth making them aware of the existence of this phenomenon and sensitizing them to common examples of it. Okay, so to conclude, we've gone through these examples of connected speech. So I think we need to consider, well, just how important is it? Well, back in 1990, Brown, an American linguist, was making the point that there is, for students who've always focused on accuracy, the correct pronunciation of individual words, that when they get to the segmental level, that's when words link together, there's a devastating diminution of phonetic information. Things disappear, things change. Students find it difficult to understand normal speech. And that would kind of argue for the kind of course books that really wanted to teach this as the only model, the importance of connected speech in British English. Then, and around the same time, 1988, Kakru was positing his models of the three-circle model of English, the inner, the outer, the expanding circle. In other words, the numbers of people who use English as an international language for contact is much greater than the number of native speakers. So shouldn't we really be thinking about a pronunciation norm that meets the needs of the majority rather than the small minority of British English speakers? And then in 2000, Jennifer Jenkins, now at the University of Southampton, wrote her phenomenally important book, The Phonology of English as a Lingua Franca, in which she made the point, connected speech actually isn't important for intelligibility for that majority of speakers from the outer circle. So with that in mind, I'd like to suggest the following. You will see connected speech in course books and in pronunciation books particularly, but it is not a part of the Lingua Franca core. And in fact, you may decide that if your students are not really going to be using English with native speakers or English native speakers, that there are other aspects you want to spend more time working on. However, it may well be important if your students are going to be doing international exams where they will hear these features of connected speech. And therefore, with your learners, I really think you should be making principled decisions about the relevance or not of connected speech based on the speaking and the listening needs of those learners. So here's a reading list of some of the sources that I went to in preparing this talk, this masterclass. I've tried to get a mixture here of web pages, articles, books, but also videos. And just to close, can I please remind you of the wonderful resource that Gallery Teachers has in its many, many masterclasses. If you found this one useful, there will be further pronunciation masterclasses happening in the future. Thank you very much indeed for your time today.